Well, thank you for this very elaborated introduction, which actually helps me a lot because I... Oh, it's not on?
It's just recording. It's not
Oh, I see.
Then please speak up a bit.
Okay. I will try. Otherwise, I'll start singing. Perhaps my voice then carries further than when I just talk. But I don't need to spend much time on this bio because I think you introduced me already a lot. I emphasize trust because trust is really, not my hobby horse. It's kind of obsession, I assume. So whenever I read something or hear people talk, if the word trust pops up, then I'm suddenly in a kind of hyper-focus mode. And perhaps some of you know that with your own research, that some of these key concepts really attract your attention a lot. So I'm obviously biased when I'm telling you that I think that over the last decade, trust and in relation to technology has gained a lot of attention. Trust in the digital society, trust in the data-driven economy, what have you. So trust really is an important concept, an important idea when thinking of our data-driven society. And I think this makes sense. If we are working towards becoming a data-driven society, it would be very, it would not be helpful if people didn't trust the technologies they use, because it would be very, very complicated to go about your everyday life without using these technologies. So a lot of policymakers and companies are investing in helping people to trust the technologies they bring to the market, to trust the technologies they use to interact with their citizens. And also in academia, we saw a lot of interest also in user experience research. So how can we design technology in such a way that people feel they can trust the technology. Also from a legal point of view, I think strengthening data subject rights is a way of empowering people and enabling them to trust technologies or tech companies. So I think that trust still is a key concept in thinking about our interaction with technology. I also recently, I think I saw a shift, a new focal point to trustworthiness. And you might think, well, trustworthiness, it's almost the same word. Does it make a difference? I think it does. And this is actually what I am interested in now. So where does this change to trustworthiness, where does it come from, and should we be happy about it? So where do we see this trustworthiness popping up? Well, I think I don't know, but a lot of you probably think of the ethics guidelines for Trustworthy AI that were last year published by the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, in which they kind of promote certain values, principles that should be taken into account when developing and implementing artificial intelligence, so trustworthy artificial intelligence. We also saw it in other discussions coming up. For example, in the US, you have this discussion that tech companies should become fiduciaries. So in reaction to the Cambridge Analytica case, Mark Zuckerberg, in discussion with Professor Zittrain in Harvard, said like, yes, I know, we did a bad job and we have a responsibility to protect your data, and we should do more, otherwise we don't deserve you. So there's a kind of, before we had this kind of, we are a platform, we're only giving you the tools, and then it's up to you what you do with it. So we try to keep kind of in the background. You see a kind of switch that, okay, we should take responsibility, we should become more trustworthy. I'm not saying I think these are the best examples of what trustworthiness should look like. I actually only use these examples to illustrate the shift towards trustworthiness. I think and this will be kind of thing I will be going to in this talk, is that the understanding of what trustworthiness is or should be is lacking. Nevertheless, I do champion. I do think it's a good idea to shift perspective and focus more on trustworthiness. And why do I think that? Because when we focus on trust, we focus on trustors, on people, on end users, on citizens, and we try to enable them to take risk in a responsible way. But when we focus on trustworthiness, we focus on the other side of the relation. So we focus on the one who is in power, who has a certain responsibility. So I think it's an interesting and move and might be a fruitful move to focus more on those in power and what their responsibilities are. I'm not saying that we should skip trust. I hope not, because it's still one of the things I love doing most. But I do think this combination with trustworthiness is actually a good thing. So, but not necessarily in the way that we're seeing it popping up at the moment. So yes, trustworthiness, let's go for trustworthiness. But the question is, what does it actually mean, trustworthiness? And how could we use this idea of trustworthiness to develop policies, to develop technology, to organize companies in a way that this trustworthiness is actually more than just lip service? So this is going to be actually then more or less what I'm going to do during the talk. I start with trust, because whenever I have the chance to talk about trust, I will take it. And but also because I want to show you why I think if you go into this analysis of trust, I also can show you where the limits are when we take the focus when we take this trust as a focal point. And I hope that I can then let you see how trustworthiness can be a good extra point of view to complement the problems, to complement this approach, and to hopefully address some of the current issues that we face in our data-driven society. So I'm first going to talk about trust. I will make the connection between trust and technology, trust in technology. I will tell you a little bit more about the way in which I analyze trust in data-driven contexts. So when you mentioned these smart dolls and smart cities, I engage in this analysis through this lens, which I call the 4 Cs, because then you also see why I need something extra to actually go to the core of what is at stake at the moment. So then I make this normative turn to trustworthiness, and then I'm going to talk about trustworthy tech companies. It sounds a little bit naive. We'll see how far it gets me. Okay, let's first talk about trust. So what is trust? If you would ask a psychologist, or you would ask a doctor, or whoever you would, every discipline has a slightly different perspective on what trust is. So there's not one overarching definition we all agree upon, unfortunately. Nevertheless, there are still some concepts, family of concepts that you do see popping up in these different disciplines. I like to start thinking about trust by focusing on the function of trust. So what does trust do in our everyday life? What does trust give us? So for me, trust is on a very fundamental level a strategy to deal with complexity, and this is something that's also been argued by Niklas Luhmann. And so the basic idea is that we human beings, we have to deal with a radically complex life. Why? Because we have to deal with an unknown future. So we think that we more or less know what will happen, but deep down inside we actually know that there are quite a few possible futures ahead of us, and only one can become reality, but we're never quite sure which one. So there is complexity because of time, and there is complexity because of, well, all of us. because human beings are social beings. We want to interact, we want to collaborate, we need each other to build a flourishing life. But I don't know exactly what your interests are. I don't know exactly how you're going to act. To a certain extent, you have agency, freedom. Of course, I try to predict how people will behave. I try to think or try to interpret what people are thinking. So I'm looking at your faces and I think, okay, you think it's a very interesting presentation, but obviously I'm not sure, right? You can fool me, you can think it's not an interesting talk. So I'm never sure. So when I have trust, I set aside these uncertainties and I act as if I am sure. So in a very interesting way, you could say that trust is a kind of fiction. It's a kind of pretending that you know what will happen in the future. It's kind of pretending as if you know what other people are thinking or how they will behave. Well, actually, you're not sure. But it's a very functional fiction because it makes social life happening, right? There are many other strategies to deal with complexity, and I think technology is one of them. Oftentimes, through technology, we try to predict what the future will be like. We try to design our environment in such a way that it becomes comprehensible and predictable. So there are many different ways in which we can deal with complexity. But trust, I think, is one of the interpersonal strategies that we, as human beings, have developed, which is very robust. And in the Netherlands, we have this saying, I have to say it in Dutch because I don't know how to translate it. Vertrouwen komt te voet en gaat te paard. Trust slowly enters and quickly leaves, something like that. And the idea is that it takes a long time to gain trust and then it can easily fly away. I think it's the other way around, actually. We human beings, we have a trusting attitude. And actually you can fool us and trick us quite a while before we actually think it's, no, the harms are too big to really change our actions. So why this picture? Well, I think this is how a world would look like if there would not be trust. You know, you would not be able to get out of bed in the morning because you would be overwhelmed by all the possible future states that will be waiting for you. If you can't trust that the person lying next to you is still the love of your life, if all these things are all the time things you have to think about, you have to make a cost-benefit analysis about, it would just be impossible to live your everyday life. Oh, and I didn't mention that, but if you have any questions throughout my talk, please feel free to just ask them, because otherwise I just talk and talk. But if something is not clear or I'm talking not loud enough or too quick or whatever, then please just interrupt me. Yes?
So you mentioned Luhmann, but
yeah.
Luhmann, as far as I remember, makes a distinction between trust and confidence.
Yes, he does.
Does that play a role in your work as well?
Yes. Give me 2 slides.
Oh, okay.
Trust me. Yeah. Okay, this is I'm going to stand up. This is a slide that I also use sometimes when I teach, but I think it's a funny slide, so I just use it everywhere. Because, as I said, so to understand trust, you have a kind of family of trust concepts, and just to give you kind of an easy way to remember them, you can remember this relation. This is a very interesting relation because it's a trust relation, but it goes both ways. So it's the trust goes both ways. So what do we need to speak of a trust relation? Now, first of all, obviously we need to have actors, 2 at least. I'm not going to talk about trust in yourself. So we're just going to focus on interpersonal trust. So at least 2 actors, a trustor and a trustee. And in this, let's start with the bird. So the bird obviously needs to trust the crocodile not to close his mouth. That would be very unfortunate. So there is something at stake for the bird. So whenever we talk about trust, we also talk about vulnerability. So if there's no vulnerability, if there's nothing at stake, trust is not really a useful concept. So there need to be the possibility to get hurt. If I give you my wallet and I don't care what you do with my wallet, if you take it away, my trust isn't really like damaged because I actually didn't care what you would do with it, right? So there is a kind of dependency. Yes, Rafael.
No, sorry.
Yeah.
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 I had a quick question because.
Yeah.
So about the definition of trust.
Yeah.
You said so. There's no unitary definition.
Mm.
There can be this one that sort of functions for various people.
Yeah.
But I still have the impression that the way that you framed it is sort of, you mentioned Luhmann, so this sort of how to deal with uncertainty, with risks,
Yeah.
With things that we can't control. But I was wondering, because we talk about technology, so I also think about privacy. And for instance, one definition of trust, at least one way that I see trust in relation to privacy is, for instance, when you develop bonds with others, so you share secrets with others. And I wonder whether this this sort of more privacy-related trust is also encompassed by just the fact that we can't address uncertainty, basically. I don't know. Yeah.
It creates the vulnerability.
It does create it. Yeah.
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 So I think when you think of safeguarding privacy through a trust relation, so indeed, you're sharing information, you're sharing secrets, you make yourself vulnerable to the one that you are sharing the secrets with. So this would then be the trust or sharing information. So what is at stake? Because it tells you something very important about me. So this will make you vulnerable. And then it's up to the trustee, so in this case then the crocodile or your friend, who has a kind of power, a kind of control, what he or she can or cannot or will not do with that information. So whenever that person will then tell it to somebody else, then you could say, well, there's a breach of trust. And I think actually when you take this trust relation and you put it in the privacy context, it resembles a lot the contextual integrity of Helen Nissenbaum. And also because one of the other concepts that I think are important is that trust relations always take place in a social context. So it's not in a vacuum. It's not that. So to a certain extent, you're always vulnerable. Trust is always blind, but it's not completely blind in the sense that. Take this example. This is not a regular, your average bird. This is a certified bird. He has a cap. He's certified. He has tools. So he's hopefully well educated. And he has an ongoing relation because every year he checks the teeth of the crocodile. So it's not just A trusting B. These are kind of actors in a social context, and the uncertainty that we have to deal with, or the complexity that we have to deal with, is not only dealt with through trust, but also through the social context in which the trust relation takes place. And this particular example, it goes both ways because the crocodile is also depending on the bird to perform a service, to give him clean teeth, right? So if the bird doesn't do a proper job, there is some kind of harm for the crocodile. So in this particular case, it goes both ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It can also be one-way trust relation.
When I trust that my car will work in the morning, is that also a social situation?
Okay, I feel we need to go to the trust and technology part. You're waiting for the trust and technology part. Okay, to wrap this up, so if we think about trust is a way to deal with complexity. And if you would need to have a kind of definition, I would say that trust is having positive expectations of the actions of other people, and these actions matter to you. The example, if I give something away and I don't care what happens with it, then trust is not important or a very useful concept. And what I want to stress is vulnerability. So although in everyday language, when we talk about trust, like I trust you completely, we're actually saying like there is no vulnerability, but actually trust and vulnerability are intrinsically connected. So without vulnerability, no trust. Yes? So, okay, there we are. What about trust and technology? So as I said, so trust is one way, an interpersonal social strategy to deal with uncertainty or with complexity. You could say that technology is also a strategy to deal with complexity, a material strategy. Generally speaking, we develop technology because it helps us to interact, it helps us to build our everyday lives. I think about clocks. Clocks help us to structure time, to kind of also get our hands on the future. Big data analysis already mentioned that, trying to predict what will happen, trying to find patterns. You could say that these are all strategies to deal with complexity. On the other hand, technology itself can also be a source of complexity, because although we always try or always hope that it will solve all our problems and that we're able to develop a foolproof system, it always turns out in practice that it does things that we didn't expect, for the good and the bad. Sometimes it actually it performs better than we hoped for, and sometimes it has consequences that we never thought of, that we also didn't want it to bring forth. It can also, and so not only these bad and positive consequences, but also you could say that because of these new technologies, also the way in which we see ourselves and what our preferences are also change. So we think here and now, like, okay, this will solve our problem. Then we have the technology, and then we have it, and then suddenly, because of this interaction with the technology, we develop new desires, new wishes, new things that we would like to have. So it's always going forward, right? Because our technology never actually makes us whole. There's always something we desire after that. So now let's move to the discussion on trust in technology. So I started by saying that trust, first and foremost, is seen as an interpersonal strategy. But obviously, as Tamar rightfully mentioned in the introduction, we increasingly interact with technologies, with systems, and so it makes sense to also think of trust in that particular relation, so not just between people, but also between people and systems, people and technologies. And in the academic debate, especially in philosophy of technology and ethics of technology, we have this debate, what Bart was referring to, in how you have to call it. So do we need a different word for trust when we talk about trust between people and trust between people and machines? So some people say, yes, we really need a different word. Why? Because the interpersonal aspect of trust in interpersonal relation is crucial. The fact that you know that I put trust in you has such an important effect on your behavior, on your actions. This is something which is lacking, at least currently, with technology. Technology is not aware of my trusting feelings or trusting attitude towards the technology. Therefore, it's a bit more passive. So therefore, we should talk about reliance, confidence, or system trust. Confidence and system trust it comes from Luhmann, indeed. So what you see, I like to think of it as a family of concepts. So in some concepts, trust in technology and trust in people, they share. For example, dependency is one of these concepts that they share. Vulnerability, so you still are vulnerable when you're interacting with a technology. My own point of view, I'm kind of pragmatic in the sense that I don't really care how you call it, as long as you define it in a proper way. So if you like to call it trust in technology, you like to call it system trust. I'm all fine with it, as long as you make it clear what you're actually looking at. So I'm with John Pitt here, who says, like, yeah, in order to ask the question, do we trust technology or do we trust systems, you need to be specific. And probably this is one of the first critiques I have when it comes to this trustworthy AI guidelines. It's so on a macro level. It's AI can be in so many different applications in so many different sectors. It's quite difficult on such a high level to think of trustworthy AI. So I think it's important to be specific. So we trust a technology, a certain artifact, to do something. In this way, I like to approach it.
Yeah, but you could argue that you could say something in very general terms regarding AI and trustworthiness. If you say like, we want AI to be explicit about the stuff that it is supposed to do, and then we can say that trustworthy AI is AI that actually does whatever it claims it does.
Yeah.
You can talk about it in general terms.
Yeah.
By leaving the specifics to specific AIs.
Yeah. I tend to agree there. Yes, in the sense that obviously it can be a first step to start on a kind of more abstract level, and then from there try to specify it towards more specific practices or specific context. And I actually think that this is something they are aiming at, so that they're going to be more sector specific guidelines based on a bigger one. So perhaps I should be more modest and say I will wait for the sector developments to see if I think they do a good job. But if it would be only the abstract level, I'm not really sure how it will bring us much.
If I look at this from a linguistic perspective,
Yeah.
Trustworthiness exists as a word, but confidence, worthiness, somehow doesn't work like that. Or reliance, worthiness.
Justified confidence.
Just like, you make it two words.
Reliability.
Sorry?
Reliability.
But it really does seem to be a verbal dispute.
Yeah, you think it's only verbal?
Yeah, and I think so. I see trust and trustworthiness as two sides of the same coin, or kind of like they're twins, but not identical twins. So they're related, but not the same. So if you would say like I like actually confidence more, so we're going to look at confidence and trustworthiness. You miss the alliteration, but I would be fine with that too. Yeah. Okay, so when we talk about trust, so as I said, some of the aspects that we saw in interpersonal trust actually come back in the relation towards technology. So also here, when it comes to trust, it's always blind to a certain extent. A lot of the technology that we use already halfway. Okay, I have to move quickly. Yeah. So it's always blind. So also with technology, you're not really sure what will be the outcome. It can always malfunction. It can always do things that you don't want it to do. What we see in empirical research, but also in philosophy, is that when it comes to developing trust in technology, there are some elements that help us to do that. So you have the technology acceptance model from Davis, and he focuses on perceived use and perceived ease of use. So in order what helps people to develop trust is the question, does this technology or artifact help me to reach my goal? So what's the use of it? If I don't see a proper goal for it, why would I bother using it? And the ease of use, so do I need to go through all manuals, or do I have to go to school in order to be able to use it? So these two things, very basic things actually, are important aspect. There are also others, but for now these two I would like to emphasize.
That is really focusing on the intention to actually use it, not so much trusting it.
Yes, that's true.
And it's also based, these are perceptions, so
Yeah.
that implies that there is at least some knowledge about technology, right or wrong, but so it's not really blind.
Yes, no, I totally agree there. I think what you are referring to in my family of trust concept is the social context, the embeddedness. So it's not that this trust relation, me and my iPad, is not influenced by already the information and knowledge I have, and it can also be influenced by what other people are doing. So if I have friends who use it, so especially when it comes to trust in technology, it has a high Like if others are doing it, it will be fine for me too. So there's a kind of social connection there. And so indeed, so there is a kind of also action connected to it. So it's not just thinking about the technology, but this trust is kind of expressed in the using or interacting with the technology. So I like this connection because you have like in empirical research, you have concepts, but also in, for example, Heidegger, old-fashioned philosopher of technology, who speaks of Zuhandenheit, so the fact that if a technology functions well, then it can actually become part of my body, part of my actions. I don't really notice it anymore when I'm typing. I'm actually in my text, not really focusing on the actual moves of my fingertips. It's only, for example, when my computer goes down that I suddenly realize that, I was sitting behind my computer. Suddenly I realize my environment, and then things become vuurhanden, so that's a kind of the combination. And also in this post-phenomenology here, there is one, we see this concept coming up again. So we want the transformation without the mediation, so we actually are very focused on what it brings us, so which problem it will solve and how it will empower us or enhance us, and we're not so much willing to also consider the side effects on how it actually also changes the way we perceive of ourselves, of others, and the way around us. So it's a very, almost would say instrumental perspective. Okay, so trust in a data environment, data-driven environment. So it's interesting. On the one hand, we're all using these iPads and iPhones, and they're easy to use, and they can do everything that you want them to do. And on the other hand, we see a lot of news coming up that actually these applications are making us very vulnerable to all sorts of actions. We have Facebook allowing third parties to harvest our data and steer elections. The Snowden revelations, I was writing my PhD when the Snowden revelations came out. I thought, wow, this is going to be the big change. People will now behave differently. Didn't really happen. And we have crypto and CIA, and every time you think like, well, this will probably bring a new way of interacting, because now we know that there is something off, there's something wrong, but it doesn't really happen. And it has always there was one of the things that I wanted to understand, like why don't we change? Why don't we change our actions? So then I came up with this 4C trust model, because I think one of the issues that we face with data-driven technologies is that these are networked technologies. And from a first-person perspective, so this is my first C, the context, all these things that I just mentioned, like it's easy to use, I don't need a manual, it looks nice. These are the things that I base my interaction on, because this is what I experience, this is what I feel, this is what I touch. So a lot of the things when it comes to developing trust in technology from a first-person perspective, so from an end-user perspective or a citizen perspective, is based on this, only on one layer of the technology. While I actually think that these three other C's, construction, curation, codification, which are actually also part of our data-driven applications. So for example, the construction, so is it open source? How is it built? Is it off-the-shelf application? Can I tinker with it or not? So all these questions is not really part of my trust relation. But it's, I think, really important. But it's not part of my first-person experience. The same goes for the third C, for the curation part. Obviously, I feel like it's my iPad, but is it really, if it can update overnight and can throw away books because Amazon didn't have a proper contract with a publisher and they had to retract some of the books? So suddenly, can you realize that? You buy a book in a bookshop and then overnight they come and take it away. That would be really strange, right? But because of this layered network ontology, these things can happen. So you feel as if you're in control on this level, but on a more fundamental level, when it comes what is really at stake, are you? And the fourth one, the codification, is about the legal framework and the terms and conditions, and I explicitly always list both of them. On the one hand, all artifacts are developed and implemented within or being influenced by legal framework, but in practice we also see that the terms and conditions of the companies that own these applications are very leading in how the technology actually functions.
Does this model also apply for non-data driven technology? So ordinary technology, let's say the bridge across
No.
the river?
No, not in.
Why not?
Nah, it
Same
could.
question
Yeah.
come up, like if
Yeah.
I need to cross a bridge and it's in Indonesia, it looks
Yeah.
crappy or
Yeah.
not or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and there's control in
Yeah.
legal framework and
Now, to be honest, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I was thinking something similar, trying to do the comparison. I think
Yeah.
the big difference is what you're dealing with here are technologies that are developed by companies that have very other goals than just developing the technology that you would
Yeah.
use at that first level.
Yeah.
And that already splits it to
Yeah.
many levels of mistrust.
Yeah.
So the
But I'll be.
bridge-
Yeah.
I don't know what else they're trying to do other than build a bridge that'll get you across the river.
I think the difference is you mentioned that you trust technology, you trust it based on trust to do something,
Yeah.
but it's often trust to not do something else.
Yes. Oh, thank you. You're helping me out here.
Because
Yes.
the bridge is
Yeah.
obvious what it does,
Yeah.
and yet it doesn't do something else. But if we have new technology, we have
Yes.
no idea what they're going to do with it.
Thank you. This would be. Should have been my answer. I think you're right. I thank you so much. Yeah. I think that you're right that of course all the other these 3 C's that I just mentioned, or 4 C's, I think you can also apply them to indeed a train or a bridge. But the difference here is what is at stake, the vulnerability. So when I'm in a train, if it malfunctions, the vulnerability is clear. I knew that this is one of the risks when you take a train, is that you can, it's an awful example, but that you can get injured or something. In this case, I think the vulnerability that we think that we are experiencing based on this part is very superficial. Yes, you can lose your phone. Yes, you can throw it in the bathtub and then it doesn't work anymore. But what is really at stake is behind the interface, and this is something that we're not really aware of from a first-person perspective. For example, you could be in a botnet, and perhaps your phone functions a little bit slower, but you will not really have a different experience from your iPhone, whether or not it's in a botnet. So it's not part of your first-person experience. And what is so interesting about trust is that you have to put it to the test once in a while. You know, if there's nothing at stake, if there's nothing at nothing you can lose, it's not that an important concept. So I think that in the case of network data-driven applications, trust becomes too blind. It's okay that it's a little bit blind. That's what trust is about. If you would know for sure what would happen, trust would be redundant. But the fact that we miss out of all these very important layers in our first-person experience makes us, I believe, too blind. So why? Because the perceived use and ease of use remain the same. So even if I'm in a botnet, even if I'm hacked, even if my data is being sold to Cambridge Analytica, it doesn't really matter from a first-person perspective. My Facebook page didn't look any different before or after the Snowden revelations. So there is no feedback loop. And the feedback loop is actually really important in a trust relation because it helps me to at least rethink and reflect on my choices. So actually I think we're missing out on a very important aspect of a trust relation, is that we actually don't experience on a very fundamental bodily level how we are being harmed by these layered data-driven technologies. So one way, I thought, okay, what can we do about it? Because of course I want to save the world. I thought, okay, then maybe we have to change something in the interface, right? So if we could make more explicit what's happening behind the interface, maybe then there would be a feedback loop, and maybe then people would actually change their actions or rethink their trust relations. And for example, I teamed up with an artist who developed the smell of data, a kind of perfume that would be released if you're leaking data to make people more aware of the fact that they're sharing data unwillingly. So I thought it was, and I still think that's a great idea. But I also thought, like, okay, but when you design for trust, you're oftentimes designing to make things more transparent, to make things more, to give more information to the data subject. And then, again, the burden is on the shoulders of the user, the end user. So I realized, like, is it empowering or is it overburdening when we are making this design for trust interface kind of options? So suddenly I realized perhaps this is not the answer, because it's perhaps just too big of a burden for end users. So it would actually be helpful to be able to, on some aspects where you really want people to be in charge, that they do have that information. But it would also be really nice if we could just leave things in the black box and leave it. Don't bother end users with it. But if you want to do that, then you have to be sure that what is behind the interface is trustworthy. And this is why I suddenly realized, like, okay, perhaps trustworthiness, we need to have that too when we talk about trust, because if designing for trust only means that I'm going to overburden people, then maybe this is not the way forward. So I switched from designing for trust to design for trustworthiness. And here's a yes.
Isn't that what we have to do as an end user? I have to use my app to bank.
Yeah.
Or else
Yeah.
I can't do anything. So I have to trust them.
Yeah.
I know that I can't trust them.
Yeah.
But there's no other way.
Yes. Oh, thank you for adding that. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, so in an ideal typical trust relation, you have options. You can choose. So if I don't trust you, I go somewhere else and I trust somebody or someone else. So in the particular case of some of the technologies that we have to use because, well, they're part of our critical infrastructure, or we have to use them because that's the only way to reach the government, you don't even have a choice, which actually only makes the burden should be on the shoulder of the one who is implementing and controlling the technology, only more stronger, right? So actually, I think it's a good argument why we should shift perspective and focus more on trustworthiness than on trust, because you don't always have the options, the choice. Yes.
But that goes back to the question whether trustworthiness is then just another way of saying, like, it's okay to be blind. You catch my drift. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
There's in the end, I mean, the only way that trust works is by that there's a vulnerability on the one hand, but also that there is a certain kind of like awareness of me having that vulnerability, and like you said, every once in a while checking that I'm actually okay. I mean, it's not that nothing bad is going to happen because that's my personal experience. But that experience needs to be there. If you then design something and it almost seems like you want to take away the experience part.
Okay. Yeah.
Like saying, okay, we just make it such that we give, it's almost like
Yeah.
to give guarantees, and then
Yeah.
you need that experience anymore. But then,
I see your point. Yeah. No, I should have emphasized more that I see it. I'm not wanting to replace it, but I do understand that with this previous slide, it looks like I want to get rid of trust, which I don't think is a good idea. But I do think there needs to be a bit of more of a balance. So I think it would be, and again, I don't know how to do that. So that's just, I think it would be useful if there were certain aspects of the technology or what the technology is mediating that go to the core of our everyday life, that really influence our autonomy, for example. I think on these notions, on these specific topics, it's really important that you keep on giving the opportunity of to people to actually make that choice and reflect on it and not take away their agency. But on the other hand, I think a lot of the things that you think you want to let people decide on, maybe it's better to not let them do that, because you only have limited time, limited opportunity, why not make a kind of difference between what you really want people to engage with explicitly and some of the things, especially when we're talking about really complex technology. It would be really helpful if you would have a more trustworthy black box. So I know it's tricky what I'm saying, but perhaps you can bear with me and then, yeah?
Then we can talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to make a similar.
questions and leave them for.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I'm going to the, okay, sorry, Raphael.
No problem.
Okay, so what I did was, so as I said, I think that trustworthiness now is too easy being used, so I'm doing a literature review on what I can find on trustworthiness in philosophy and ethics, and one of the definitions I really like, and it also kind of gives a general idea of what people in this area think of trustworthiness, is that to think of trustworthiness is to think of B is trustworthy with respect to A in a domain of interaction D, and only if she is competent with respect to the domain, and she would take that fact A as counting. Oh, that's too different. No, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to the. So I will give you the conclusion of my literature review, and these are the three key points that you could try to remember when we talk about trustworthiness. Is to be trustworthy means that you have to give assurances indicating that you're trustworthy, right? If you are trustworthy, but I don't know that, I can't really make use of your trustworthiness. So there is a kind of active responsibility to show that you're trustworthy. Obviously, you need to be competent in a domain, right? If a trustworthy doctor is a doctor that is educated, skilled, etc., right? So the competence in a specific domain is part of your trustworthiness. And you have to be committed. You can be a very skilled doctor, but if you don't care for your patients, you're not committed to put in your best effort, you're not trustworthy, right? So these are the three basic aspects of trustworthiness. But in the literature, these aspects are much, again, focused on this interpersonal relation. So not about trust in technologies or trust in tech companies in this specific case. So I have to try to kind of translate what it means from this interpersonal level. What would it mean if we use these concepts to think of trustworthiness in tech companies? So this is what I came up with. So give assurances. So normally in interpersonal relations, we make promises, we walk the walk, so we show that we are trustworthy. So if you think of that from a tech company perspective, so what could a tech company do in order to signal trustworthiness? I don't think that Mark Zuckerberg in court promising us that he will do a better job is really convincing. I also think it's, again, too big of a burden on users to check out all like press releases or hearings. So I think that signaling trustworthiness should take place in the design. So here the design, my old idea still resurfaces. And I think it's interesting in the sense that when we talk about trust, designed for trust, you think of ease of use, efficiency, these kinds of things. So I was wondering, if you would design for trustworthiness, would it be necessary to cut back on some of the functionality maybe, or some of the ease of use in order to signal trustworthiness? Because signaling trustworthiness is also telling where your competence ends, right? So as a company, you maybe become a bit more vulnerable, so you take a bit of the vulnerability to the company, so to say, because they need to show where their competence ends. A second aspect is that you need to be competent in a certain domain. We saw when it comes to big tech companies that they're focused on designing technology. So the technology has to be efficient, has to be state of the art. Oh, sorry, I skipped that. So the people they actually attract in these companies are tech-savvy people. And so I was thinking, okay, so perhaps these are still very important competences. If you can code, if you can't engineer, if you can do interface design, probably you're not the best one to work at these companies. But aren't there also other techno-moral competences, which I borrow from Shannon Feller, other moral competences that we should look for in tech employees? And this, I think, is a very interesting development, that we currently actually see that a lot of the talking to truth to power actually happens within companies, so that actually these employees are trying to keep check on what's happening in their companies. So, for example, the Tech One Build It movement that tried to stop and actually stopped Amazon, I guess, Amazon for delivering technology to ICE, the organization in the US tracking immigrants. So I think what would be interesting is to look at these techno-moral competences within the company. So how these people can actually help shape the trustworthiness of the tech company. And you can't. I don't think you can do that without also thinking about how these commitments are actually implemented in the company. So the third one, so be committed to putting your competences to work in service of others who count on you. I think we can translate that a tech company has to show that it really has robust commitments to being trustworthy by embedding these aspects in the organizational structure of the tech company. We have a lot of debate on ethics washing and on actually companies dodging regulation by saying that they're going to do all this, but then when you go and look in the actual organization, it's not really much more than window dressing. So I think, for example, one of the cases I would want to do is this new ethics board of Facebook that they're installing. At first sight, it seems to be kind of with real power, etc., and independency. But it would be very nice to see. Are you second? No. Now, so I think it would be a very nice case study to see whether or not it actually means something. But Google tried, and even before they actually had their first meeting, it was already cancelled. So I think this is an interesting thing. And on the one hand, I will be wrapping up now. So another way of visualizing these three aspects of trustworthiness is, so you start device, so you signal trustworthiness in the design of the device, and you can only do that if people working in the tech company have techno-moral values, so they're aware of the impact of the device on society. They have ways of reaching out to end user. They have ways to see how they impact the world around them. And this can only be done in a proper way if it is there's commitment in the organization, and it really has force and power within the organization. I think if you don't take this holistic point of view of trustworthiness, you really run the risk of indeed engaging in ethics washing or indeed engaging in lip service. So this is why I think this more holistic approach to trustworthiness in the relation to data-driven technologies and tech companies might be a way of putting more of the burden on those in power and making room for end users, citizens, to actually gain some room to really think and reflect on the things that really matter. Yes, I made it. Yeah, that was it.